to the first, oh, actually, it's like the second, but the first of the reinvented weathering change seminar series. And it's you will see on this schedule, we're having seminars about 3 out of 4 weeks out of each month. Some of them are virtually, or most of them are virtually. I have them all across the world. But today we are starting off with our first in-person, and first one is Joshua Benoit, and he'll be talking about elevated drought and heat tolerance of mosquito eggs are critical to increasing human preference. And
okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some recent projects. Apparently, I just peeked online, and my one grad student, Shovik, who did a lot of this work, is on. So if I really get stuck and can't answer any questions, I'm just calling him and have him answer. He probably didn't know that would happen. He probably would have showed up if he knew that would happen. So so what else my lab worked on? We work on a whole bunch of different insect stuff. So we also have some vertebrate projects as well, but they're mainly computational bioinformatics. So we do a lot of work on stress tolerance in invertebrates, and so ectotherms in general, microbiome interactions, mother-offspring conflict. I have a really cool climate change project with Sinead English at the University of Bristol, and using live bird insects to understand how climate change can vary. So and so that's some mother offspring, some ectoparasite resistance. I did some work on Antarctic arthropods, still have a few papers on that. Keep trying to apply to grants to go back again. Keep telling me no. I'll keep doing that until they tell me yes again. I work on sleeping mosquitoes, RNA modifications, and visual processes. So there's a lot of things we work on in the lab. And so it really depends on the system and the question, and do we think it's interesting, and do we think it can also get great money at some point, are pretty much the two major driving factors for the projects we work on. So this is overall the highlight of my talk today. So I always usually give a couple little short videos of some aspects not related to the talk, and then I'll move and start talking about some of our recent studies on mosquito eggs and why they're so critical for understanding how mosquitoes survive through climate change. So the first one I'll talk about is some work that I work on, kind of learning resistance to parasites through using Drosophila mite interacting systems. So this is mainly with Mike Pollock, who's also another faculty member in biological sciences. So this is a cool little system we work on with these flies that get attacked by these little mites here. It's like getting a tick the size of a cat. So, it ticks the size of a cat, and they bit you. And flies can handle one, they can handle a couple. If it gets to this level, they might eventually just rip them apart and just eat the whole fly. So normally they don't do that. And so we can do a lot of studies with this. It's a behavioral resistance to an ectoparasite. So we can take flies in the field population, select them for resistance, and figure out what's going on with this process for parasite resistance. And so we've done selection studies for these. We're doing some more projects now with 2 other species, other aspects. And it turns out when you do selection, one of the big things, resistance, so it's pretty, we think it's as simple as, in this case, if you're sleeping and you get attacked by a cat-sized tick, you're not going to be able to defend yourself. If you're awake, then you're probably more easily able to defend yourself. And so they actually sleep a lot less during the night, the dark periods, and that's when the mites usually attack. So it just impacts on sleeping ones. And then through a combination of a lot of other studies, we took a whole bunch of different lines with different levels of sleep, and it confirmed our results. So overall, it turns out behavior resistance to these ectoparasites is associated with sleep processes, and actually confirmed some other studies that were involved in like monkeys with mosquitoes and a few other things that reduce sleep seems to be a way to actually not be parasited by ectoparasites as much. So that's one study we're working on. Another one we're working on is we do a lot of work in mosquitoes and drought. And this is a recent study where we are looking at how drought impacts refeeding of mosquitoes. So the general consensus for mosquitoes is they take a blood meal, don't feed again, lay eggs. Okay, so that's a general thought. That's not what's really been observed in the field. In this one here is you see multiple blood meals from the same mosquito. So like blood meal 1, blood meal 2. So take multiple. So we wanted to figure out why. And so it kind of assumed that maybe they didn't take a good first blood meal, but that didn't explain how often that was actually seen. And this was a study done by a lot of different people within the lab. And what we did is we did these experiments where we take mosquitoes and we thought maybe if they can't find a good wet condition to rest while they're digesting the blood, they'll refeed again because of dehydration. So we took the mosquitoes, we blood fed them, and then offered additional blood meals, but kept them under wet and dry conditions. And we did them on different scales, like small individual cages, all the way to effectively room-sized cages under these conditions. They were all done in Crossley Tower, so I lost my indoor field site because they're not tearing it down. Because they didn't care what I did that building for approximately 8 years. So we had humidifiers, all that, like, yeah, whatever. So, but then we also did ones where we saw how this impacted their behavior. And it turns out if they're put under dry conditions, which are all the dark bars here, you'll see this massive increase in refeed. And this is really important for disease transmission because the number of blood meals taken really impacts the level of disease transmission, both how you pick up the disease and how you transmit the disease. And so, and then when we did this on big scale here, which we did a lot less under wet and dry conditions, under dry conditions, twice as many would feed. So that's 2 times as many blood meals per batch of eggs laid, which is like, will actually quadruple the amount of disease transmission. So it's really important. Why does this happen? It turns out that if they can't find a good resting site, they'll dehydrate, and then their activity profile and their host sensing returns earlier than expected, and then they'll refeed again. And so it's this increase in activity. We did a whole bunch of work studies, but that was now published earlier this year. And we also did modeling to predict how this would impact disease transmission in the long term. And it turns out substantially and a lot. So it increases survival substantially and increases disease transmission a lot, mainly because they can use this refeeding to kind of bridge small dry periods without having these declines in reproductive output. So, all right. So now we're going to move on to the actual main talk. And it's a combination of how mosquito eggs are important to understanding how they survive climate change, their interaction with humans, and those. And so mainly, there's a lot of changes going on in the world. This was made by my grad student. This is where he's from, but he wanted to emphasize that you're seeing a lot more people in urban areas compared to rural. This has been happening for years upon years upon years. And the difference is just increasing pretty much from year to year. And then you're seeing less forests. You're seeing this kind of urbanization that's occurring, and it's really occurring throughout the world in different areas. And you can hit pretty much any city unless it's like, let's say like some parts of like Detroit or Cleveland where they're actually like tearing down neighborhoods to turn back into parks. Most other cities are growing and expanding their footprint. So here's Gamma, Arizona, where you can see in 1985, there was all this farmland, more rural area, and now it's grown to this. This is Istanbul in Turkey, and you can see the kind of urban sprawls growing and growing and growing. So this is really happening everywhere in the world. And so, and even if you look here, you know where this is, Cincinnati, and you can see we have this large kind of urban stretch right through the middle that kind of run along Mill Creek. But even here, it's spreading. But you get different kind of spreading here. We're seeing more kind of like suburb spread at the edges. So, but it's kind of this urbanization is causing this happening. And then Along with this, understanding the movement of vectors with humans. So there's a lot of aspects where vectors are being moved throughout the world. And so some of them are more recent, some of them are more ancient. But it's been happening for a long time. And really, they go along trade routes, travel routes, different locations. And really, to be a big issue, you have to have like the location A and maybe a pathogen location B end up in the same spot. So for example, Aedes mosquitoes we'll talk about, normally we don't have yellow fever here anymore, but if someone brought yellow fever back in, we have Aedes here that were brought in, you could have an outbreak of Aedes-borne diseases such as yellow fever, Zika, dengue within the U.S. pretty easily. And we do have outbreaks of dengue within the U.S., but they're mainly limited to Puerto Rico and the kind of subtropical areas. So this is going to be the focus of the talk is Aedes aegypti. It's the yellow fever mosquito. This is what the close-up looks of it. It's biting somebody. I don't know who is biting there. It's not me. So which is good. To go back though is when I was showing the hands for the feeding earlier, we do live host feeding because we have to do live host feeding for the experiments. It's all IRB approved. So it's all IRB approved, and I just had my first full audit this year as well, and I passed with flying colors, which I think was pretty good. Like I had one little thing I had to fix. So it was so we had to do that there. So this mosquito has been really spreading over the last 600 years. Okay. So at some point it was pretty much limited to parts of Africa, but it has spread into the New World. It has spread into parts of Southern Europe. It has spread across into Australia. So Aedes aegypti now has worldwide distribution. We have its nasty little sister here, Aedes albopictus. During the summer, if everybody goes outside, you get bit by that little tiny black and white mosquito. So everybody knows what I'm talking about around here. During the daytime, yes, yeah, okay. That's Aedes albopictus. There is some differences in them. I'm not talking about it. Aedes albopictus can survive the winter because its eggs can undergo dormancy. Aedes aegypti cannot. So we'll have Aedes aegypti in Cincinnati every year, but it shows up because people come up with waste and dumps and tires, and there's some processing areas in Cincinnati. Then they'll come up, show up in the summer, but then die off. They have to be reintroduced every year. Aedes albopictus, on the other hand, can overwinter and survive here. So that's two differences. But for the sake of diseases and a few other factors, they can transmit very similar diseases. So, all right. So moving on to this, why is this eggs key to survival? A lot of mosquito eggs, such as Culex and Anopheles, so malaria vectors and like West Nile virus vectors, have to lay their eggs directly onto water, and they hatch in water within a week. Okay, so they have very different eggs than the Aedes species. They lay them at the water line on wet material, and then they take about 2 weeks to embryonate, and then they're ready to hatch, and then they can hang out there for almost 3 to 4 months there. If the temperature's cooler, they can hang out there for weeks or even longer for months. And so it's a very different cycle. So this can allow them to kind of go through dry periods and then reemerge when rainfall goes above the water line when they were laying. So it's a pretty ingenious system. The mother also expresses specific genes that allow her to retain the eggs that are not found in other species. So it's very unique. And how is this done? And mainly they have a really, like I have an innovation on this one still, but they have a very waterproof cuticle, and that's the major difference in these. And how does this allow them to survive? They go for the survival time in days, so Aedes aegypti, under extremely dry conditions, at least 4 months. So I mean, we're not talking like kind of dry, we're talking, you take the piece of paper, set it on this desk, 4 months later, you come back, throw it in the water, the larvae pop out and go, like they're just ready at that time. And so it's months of time. So this allows them to get through dry periods of hot periods. So for this work, it mainly focused on specific lineages of mosquitoes that we got from a colleague, Noah Rose, and they're from this Sahel region of Africa. And these different lineages have no preferences for humans, no ancestries, and they're from known levels of different population. So we know the history of these and where they're collected. So we analyzed these ones and want to determine what's going on with these mosquitoes and how different in thermal tolerance, dehydration tolerance, those aspects are impacted by these factors. And so we did a combination of experiments. So, and really all these lines kind of go across this kind of urban to rural economy in this area. And so it is still remain largely unexplored other than some specific aspects. So basically, the overall aims of this is 3 separate projects. And it's to understand the preventive resilience of Aedes aegypti. And we focus first on understanding the thermal tolerance of Aedes aegypti and the other stages in relation to human preference, location infected from local climatic variables. Then this drought tolerance and how it impacted their egg differences between local adaptations, urban adaptation. And then we followed it up with kind of a parental exposure study in the mosquitoes, where we took the adult females and put them under different conditions and saw how it impacted egg thermal tolerance and hatching. So the first study was a combination of these people Emily shared via, they were undergrads here that did a lot of the work. Noah collected a lot of the mosquito eggs. During his time in his PhD with Lenny McBride's lab and the Peter Arnold's for health facility analysis as well. And he helped with some work on Aedes albopictus, but we didn't include it in this paper. And then mainly a lot of the work was with Shovik here. So this is Shovik, he's on here. This is mainly a lot of its work, pretty much actually all of this work is a combination of his thesis. And so we actually just posted his 3rd paper from his thesis on bioRxiv earlier this week. So just the drought stuff was just posted. So this is really good. So, all right. So the thermal tolerance aspect of mosquitoes is mainly for life stages. There's usually this optimal temperature where you have the best development, best growth aspect. Where if you go beyond that, either you slowed or you get more mortality or kind of your fitness traits are impacted. And so it's usually an optimal range, like for here, it would be like 22 to about 32 or 35 within this window here. But if you get outside that, you end up with a lot of issues. And within the range, some factors may be better. So such as like larval development may be faster, but then you make slightly smaller adults, slayless eggs. So it's kind of a hit or miss. So there's usually a range that's optimal. But that's because some traits are good, some traits are bad, but they all balance out to kind of reach the fittest range. And that happens to all the arthropods. And so from our study, we wanted to look at kind of how all the regional adaptations, local climate aspects, and human interactions occur within this aspect of thermal tolerance of mosquitoes. And so basically, what it comes down to is that we know thermal stress can reduce survival, which we expect. That always happens. They're ectotherms. And then urban influences vary by life stage. And so we did aspects with basic eggs and then adults and see what happened here. And so it was a big study here where we did all these different treatments, exposed eggs, larvae, and adults. And then we gave them these short periods of stress, allowed them to recover and kind of measure survival counts. It's really easy for larvae and adults because then you just come back and look at them and they're either moving or they're not moving. Eggs get to be a little bit more annoying because they're on these little egg kind of patches. So you have to take those, put them in water with a little bit of food, and then wait for the larvae to emerge to know if they're viable. So that can be a little bit of an issue there. We also related it to kind of these local ecological and then in respect with their interaction with humans. And then of all the sites where they were reflected, we know a lot of the local temperature variables in those aspects, temperature, precipitation, those aspects. And so we kind of model these together to see what the effect is. So the general trend for adults, the first thing we had is there's really wasn't a big difference between our different lineages. So we had our rural and our urban lineages. We didn't see a big difference in adult heat tolerance. Partially expected, we did see a little bit of an increase, but if we had more lines, it could have been significant. But we only had 7, or we only had really 7 by the time we read the studies. And so this is not surprising because an adult, if it's too hot, it can just kind of away if you're looking at something that's cooler. So it has really good escapability. So, but then when we started moving into the larva, we did start seeing some significant differences where you'll start seeing that at these higher temperatures, the ones from these urban areas that have a higher human preference are more resistant to thermal stress. And so this is not surprising. They usually have to live in urban areas, don't use as much shade. There are these artificial water sources that can actually heat up very quickly. And so, and then we finally moved to egg. This is where we start seeing some of the more drastic results, where you start seeing effects even at lower temperatures. And eggs are sessile, even the larva, if they're within a water container, they can still move around a little bit in there. The egg, once it's laid in that spot, that's where it's at. Like it can't move, nothing can happen, it's stuck. So it has to have the highest level. So we actually saw that eggs had this biggest difference between these urban lineages and the rural lineages in actual heat tolerance differences. And so this just summarizes where all the green ones, where there was significance. There was one significant in the adults, but it wasn't really that important. The larva was really at the highest temperature we measured, but then we pretty much saw the differences significantly among all the treatments for the eggs. And so we ended up doing a whole bunch of modeling with this to see how this interacted with where they were collected from. So it had a significant interaction with density and a lot of these density and the ancestry as well. And then we made this kind of human specialization syndrome. This is a combined value where we merged the local population numbers and the ancestry and how much they actually prefer humans as one factor. And so from this, we saw a really heavy interaction where the ones from urban areas, this human specialization system really showed a really big association with this thermal tolerance. So it turns out mosquitoes really for their eggs, if they prefer humans to live in these urban environments, have a much higher resistance. This is a big thing. For this data here for the thermal tolerance, the local weather conditions, we didn't see any big associations with this. Not sure why, but it's actually, I'll talk about the next section a little bit why. They're more associated with ground aspects. And so, yeah, great.
Say local weather, you depend when you're measuring this, what you said, at that moment, or really you're trying to find or something?
So it's the local climate for like the average for the year. They should be able, these mosquitoes should be able to survive in that area the whole time. But there's some dry periods, wet periods. Yeah. And so in summary for this one, it's pretty much as mosquitoes, they're becoming more specialized towards human, they become more resistant to thermal tolerance, particularly the egg stages. And if you're interested in this one, here's a little QR code. It was published in Thermal Biology, Journal of Thermal Biology this year. So, all right, so then the next one we wanted to do is we're going to expand on this, but we were interested in looking at drought tolerance for these. So we took a lot of, I'll explain it first. So these are a lot of people that worked on it and showed it was in charge of this. And these are some of the undergrads here and here. Dr. Yanni Zial, she did the math department. She helped with some of our modeling. And then Chris helped with some of these studies as well. And so mainly, the reason we were interested in these long periods of drought, we already knew that they could survive extended periods, months without water. But we wanted to know if you, like a lot of those other studies maybe varied just like the relative humidity, but kept coming up for the same temperature. But we wanted to make a better discrete set to understand how these urban mosquitoes could survive drought a little bit better. And so basically, we were looking at this kind of urbanization, slight depressions on this. And if there are these warm urban areas, how this impacts egg survival. And so the general consensus with this is we should know increasing dehydration stress reduces egg hatching. So we should get this for all of them. So the longer you keep them under dry conditions, you'll eventually reach this cliff where you'll just get lower egg viability. But we think there'll be urban rural differences in this as there's higher levels of stress that occur. And so we set this really cool little experiment where we took all of these different conditions. So we had like 3 relative humidities, 3 temperatures. None of these should be lethal to the mosquito eggs, just by the temperature exposure or the relative humidities for at least a month period. Okay, so it's not one of those factors specifically, it's more probably a combination of those factors that would cause mortality. And then what we did is we put these under a whole bunch of different conditions and then pulled the eggs at all these different times and then evaluating egg hatching. And so this is for go back to here. This involves a lot of poor undergrads, putting a little paper in there, filling it with water, giving a little bit of food, allowing it to sit for 3 days, and going in back and counting the head capsules that popped from the eggs. So you can't count larvae because they're cannibals, they eat each other. So you have to rely on eggs that actually are validated and emerge. So we set this up here, and then we also associate with the same variables we had before. Like I said, we know where these mosquitoes are from, the lineages, if they prefer humans, the kind of local weather events. And so here's pretty much a summary of the results. I don't even know how many hours and hours of counting this is, but it was a lot. And so these saturation deficits are based on the combination of temperature and relative humidity. If you have a low relative humidity, high temperature, you're probably going to lose water extremely fast. So this right here, 37, would reflect like 33% relative humidity, the highest temperature. That is extremely dehydrated environment. That would be effectively a this. Egypti survive in the desert. They're found in Phoenix area. So that. And so egg hatching is pretty similar among the low levels of stress between the different lines. But as you move to these very stressful conditions and as time extends, you'll see this difference begin to occur where you'll actually see the urban lines have much higher viability difference, much higher egg viability under these extremely prolonged drying conditions. And so it pretty much, most of the differences occur in this area, which is 12 to 20 weeks of exposure to dry conditions. This is not surprising. So for example, if you're in a relatively dry area that has a dry season, the mosquitoes will lay their eggs on the edge towards the end of a wet season, and then it goes dry, and that water level may not go above where the female laid those eggs for months. That happens here too. So, okay. So we looked at a lot of different variables here. There was a lot more association with specific climate variables in association with the urban rural differences in the viability of these things. So it turns out these conditions, this increased drought tolerance, is likely much more important for adapting to local weather conditions. But we also saw this human specialization syndrome again, and got a significant interaction with that as well. And that takes into account ancestry, density, and preference here. And so it turns out, again, the ones that prefer humans from an urban area are much more resistant to this prolonged exposure to dry conditions. So that allowed them to survive probably over long periods in associated with a dry humid area. And a lot of times the dry humid areas they're drier unless they're artificially warmer. So, all right, and so this is here, pretty much the summary here is that you'll see these seasonal shifts of increased drought tolerance as you're moving to more urban areas. And it's probably allows these mosquitoes to survive in these dry regions. And beyond that, we actually took this data because we now have this really cool data set, this egg viability with drought. And we wanted to model how this actually could impact mosquito survival in specific areas. And this is with the help of Amy Zal, Shovik, and Amy worked on this. And we developed all these models by these insights, and it's based on a lot of this data here. So we were better able to predict how these eggs would survive in these kind of during these dry periods. And then a lot of the other data were obtained from other papers. And so, for example, like larval heat tolerance adult, how long it takes to mature, how long it takes to oviposit. So we were able to actually kind of take all this previously available data, merge our new egg viability, and be able to predict some aspects with this. And we did a whole bunch of different sites as well, but I'm not going to talk about that here. Really what it talks about is if you take it to an urban or the rural area, you'll see these urban mosquitoes, particularly in dry areas, will show much higher levels of survival. And it really comes down to the fact that because you have these eggs that can survive this long dry period, your populations can more quickly bounce back with more numbers. And so this allows you to kind of bridge these kind of dry seasons and then have more mosquitoes emerge and quickly develop when wet seasons return. Because you need wet seasons to have kind of pools of water to complete larval development. All right, and so then for the last study here, we'll talk a little bit about how parental exposure to wet conditions shapes reproductive success. I'm sorry about this. It just didn't get it out right. And this is a combination of Gabby, Emily, Lynn, Luke, Andrea, Jasmine, and Dia, and Shovik ran most of this. And these were a lot of undergrads, again, having to count for egg viabilities. They have to look at them, count them. A lot of time under scope. Everybody would usually double count them to make sure they got the same results to validate them. So it takes a long period of time. And we actually submitted a study, got the initial reviews back. Yes, changed stuff we just recently, but it's also available. So the general concept with this is, particularly for ectotherms, there is a lot of like parental exposure to wet and dry conditions can really impact the kind of success. So not a lot of people have done work in this with mosquitoes except for dormancy. So what they know from this, for some mosquitoes like A's, I'm gonna pick this point all the way back to talking about that earlier. Their mothers get cued to put eggs into dormancy, and they overwinters eggs. It's critical they overwinters eggs because those eggs can survive months of dehydration, and if it's cool, that allows them to get through the winter. So then they won't develop until better fishery occur. But we were more interested in this kind of on a shorter term scale. So, and particularly for Aedes aegypti, which doesn't overwinter. So if a mother is exposed to specific conditions, particularly wet or dry conditions, how would that impact aspects related to egg viability and even heat tolerance? And so those are some aspects we wanted to do. So what we set up were these parental environmental conditions, and it was both the mother and the dad put together under these wet, dry conditions. And then we looked at some of the parental physiology and then the offspring traits. And with the overall goal was to actually begin to look at how this could impact increased offspring resilience under changing conditions. So like if a mother is exposed to like dry periods while she's digesting a blood meal, how would that impact like aspects related like egg growth? And so this is the setup we ran through. So we took our four little, if you spelled it wrong, but we'll take our little mosquito pupa, put them under wet and dry conditions, and then they emerged. And then for a period of time, for 8 days, we kept them under wet or dry conditions. Then we blood fed them and then switched them to wet or dry conditions. But some of them we moved from wet to dry, in other words, we moved from dry to wet, back and forth. So we ended up with 4 separate conditions: the wet to dry, dry to wet, wet to dry conditions. Then we observed how this impacted egg laying patterns. And then we looked at egg storage, how it impacted total number of eggs, cumulative eggs, egg hatching, egg nutritional composition, egg different aspects that we examined here. And so in general, what we found is that it seemed to have an impact on egg production and when they lay eggs. So usually you wet feed the mosquitoes, they kind of, under these wet conditions, this is what a typical egg laying pattern would look like. Usually lay them over like a couple day period, and then they're done, but it almost always looks like this. Dry, you saw kind of a reduction in the numbers here, but we saw a different pattern of wet to dry than you will see. So it seems to impact how they deposit eggs. This is not surprising. If they're getting exposed to specific variable conditions, to be wet to dry, they may actually retain eggs longer, and they're trying to find more sites to lay them, or and that can impact when they cycle egg. There's also a minor difference in the egg hatching number between these, but overall this is pretty clear. The one thing we actually ended up seeing from this is it turned out very specific conditions would impact the egg thermal stress or ability to resist thermal exposure. So we did some temperature scale at 33, 37. We knew this shouldn't have a big effect here. There's some minor differences here. But when we get into this wet to dry condition, the eggs deposited by those females actually had a higher thermal tolerance. And so we're not sure exactly why. We have some specific kind of thoughts about that, but it's in general, and we just reproduce under 2 different temperatures and under a couple of different experimental results. So it looks like female exposed wet conditions probably allowed them to develop their eggs and build reserves better. But then fed under dry conditions seem to produce eggs that are more resistant to thermal stress. And then we can look at this transgenerational efficacy under hydration stress. And we have a few different lines here, but in general, constant wind conditions and persistent dehydration reduced transgenerational performance. We also end up looking at kind of nutrient reserve levels for these. So we take little eggs, line them up, and look at glycogen, protein, lipid levels. And we can know if there's difference among these. We do see some differences in the glycogen levels of wet to dry, and that's been previously associated with increased thermal resistance thermal stress. So they'll actually deposit more glycogen into the eggs, and that seems to be a factor that increases resistance, increased resistance thermal stress. So that could be a reason of results why we're seeing here. But this is a general summary of what we have from these studies. So this is like the parental moisture environment will impact the eggs, and it's how it impacts the eggs. And specifically, the main take home is under wet to dry conditions. It seems like there's going to be a reduction in eggs. They're going to lay them at a different pattern, but the ones they lay actually have increased thermal tolerance. So that could be an advantage, but also a trade-off because they're producing less eggs and not depositing them as quickly. So that could be a difference there. And so here's the overall summary. Kind of our big thing is early life stages, so eggs and larvae show the most differences in thermal stress among our studies. And then while the mobile adults had less direct association between human preference and heat tolerance. For these ones, our initial studies only had about 7 or 8 lines. If we had probably 50 lines, I'm guessing even the adults, there were some minor differences, but it would probably be enough to pull them apart as well. It's just the number of things we had. Egg hatching was similar for all lines under non-stressful conditions, but when you moved into these like really prolonged dry conditions, you'll see increased resistance to drought stress in mosquitoes selected from more urban areas. And then the parental exposure will actually increase offspring increase. And so it looks like what transition to wet to dry conditions around blood meal time seems to actually yield females that will produce eggs was slightly higher than $13. And so, and mainly, for the future aspects of this, there's a lot of different, it's really thinking, it's not just thermal stress and so climate change, thermal, drought, those aspects, particularly with mosquitoes, ectotherms, are very intertwined in how they interact. And so one of the big things we figured out with some of our studies is that we define there's a new human specialization syndrome, and this is for mosquitoes that predominantly probably Aedes aegypti, there's an Aedes aegypti, aegypti, and Aedes aegypti formosus. The formosus is the ancient one, and it predominantly feeds on animals, it makes it so animals, it's still around. And it intergresses and breeds back and forth to Aedes aegypti, aegypti, which prefers more humans. And as they become more specialized in human, there's some traits such as increased thermal tolerance, increased dehydration tolerance that seems to be occurring as well. So as part of this human specialization syndrome, our modeling suggests that basically by this high resistance to drought, you can have populations reach potentially millions in a couple of years because it allows them to kind of bridge all these dry periods. And generally, there's projections for wider mosquito distribution throughout the world. It's not just as clear as like we'll have malaria here, and they'll also still have malaria in parts of the tropics. It'll probably get too hot and dry in the tropics. So it's not as simple as stuff spreading. It's going to spread in some places and expand, disappear in other places, particularly for arthropod mosquitoes. So, all right, and so on that note, I would like to thank all of the individual people here. And so it's a lot of undergrads did it. Shovik, Chakraborty, who's asking for this. A lot of our collaborators with these studies here. Here is everybody from the lab. This is the general lab members around with Shovik. We did a lot of work here. Here is us at Christmas party or holiday party at Ale House before it closed. This is us at our lab outing a couple summers ago. We went to Young's Dairy and had ice cream and went hiking and fed the goats. So thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Give students an opportunity first. Anybody have questions? I'll just break the ice. So a couple of things. Let's think about Cincinnati for a minute. A lot of this work was done in regions in Africa,
Yeah.
but the principles are there. And I want to two elements which you very well know. So Cincinnati's getting warmer, it's getting wetter. There's more variability, like a lot of places. And another condition in Cincinnati is that there's more and more efforts for urban greening.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could kind of put those factors together and kind of, just muse, I suppose, on what ways we might be wanting to anticipate issues in the urban area.
So the urban area of Cincinnati is weird a little bit in respect to this because it's not really that big of a true urban area. And it's like if
What are you talking about, the urban density and?
not necessarily urban density, I'm just talking about and not even concrete jungle. Go back to the picture. In general, Cincinnati is already very green. So in comparison to a lot of places, so I know like I live. I think I live right here. I think that's Oakley. Yeah, Oakley. I live actually probably right there. That's where I live. So in my backyard, I see at least 8 types of mosquitoes. So predominantly Aedes albopictus in those aspects. So within Cincinnati, it's more probably we're starting to already seeing it now. It's just a northward movement of subtropical associated insects. We're seeing it first with ticks. So we now have Gulf Coast ticks and Lone-Star ticks here. And we're starting to see more deer ticks, which means more viruses. And so a combination, so out in the field station out in Harrison, I think it's, here's 275. I think it's still a little further out there. But there's, I'm trying to find it. So somewhere out here, where we used to only see American dog ticks, we now see Gulf Coast ticks. And we found some deer ticks. So Joe's got layers and those for ticks, which we use in every season. And that's because we have some data which we haven't published yet, where it's that seems to be like our winter. It's cold right now for the winter, but it's not that cold over the course of the winter. So we think a big issue with those is they actually burn through their nutrient reserves overwintering because we have too many small bouts of getting warm. If that makes sense. So they have a finite amount of nutrients they can use to like overwinter. Then they have to pop out and quest. And the local dog ticks burn through that about twice as fast based on the new temperature as a more southern tick where it's up here. It's like if you grew up in a warm area versus grew up in a cold area, like ones coming from the south up are adapted for a slightly warmer environment, slightly warmer winter, so they're not burning through their nutrient reserves as fast. So like there's aspects like that. Mosquitoes, which is a little hard to tell exactly. Time will tell. My guess is once we get to the point where we have like little to no freezing during the winter, then we'll have like truly subtropical species that'll pop up here. Right now, we don't have any of those except during the parts of that summer.
One more time with that question. Is you're not anticipating that any major shifts because of greening efforts? Because we've already got such green space. And you think that perhaps the biggest shift would happen once we stop having, freezing
Yeah.
temperatures in the winter.
Yeah, my guess is that we already have a very, very green city. And I mean, if you start, like, we have a lot of like, other than here, other than this like little pocket here, the green areas, so because you have like Mount Airy and then you have kind of, what's this? I can't remember. So you have like kind of Mount Airy forest and you have like Alt Park and all that. It's pretty quickly to be outside, but it's overall relatively green. There's a lot of space here. You end up with a loss of some like ticks because they need certain vertebrate animals, but mosquito wise, I think it's a pretty kind of benign area. So we can model, so in our paper where we did the 86 days, you can model putative survival in this area, but it's not really like it's, I think it's just you get to the point where it doesn't freeze anymore. And then that's when the subtropical species really pop in. Or you have very low freezings. So not like it is right now, where we have a week where it's all sun, like -5 Celsius.
So are there other insects that are out there that, with the changing of both the lack of freezing and all that, that we'll be seeing more of those coming up that are out there other than mosquitoes and ticks?
Probably kissing bugs. So we're seeing, we already have kissing bugs here. We have kissing bug shock disease, American trypanosomiasis. We have those here. You'll probably start seeing those more, but we've had those in Ohio for the past probably 300, probably. Just, but like it's getting really established big populations of them, and it's the overwintering. Just like that freeze. Once you get, if you're not in overwintering already, then you'll end up dying from that. But then you have also vice versa. If you're like a beneficial species, like a mosquito predator that relies on overwintering, and then you end up like, and then the winter keeps getting milder. Eventually, you either like you could be have like one developmental cycle, or eventually you get to the point where like you like can't survive overwintering because it's too warm. And then at that point, you just do another whole developmental cycle there, but then your body type may not be adapted to that. So
So this is all really interesting. It sounded to me like in general, the urban mosquitoes were better adapted to this, these extremities of climate. So that sounds like what I kept thinking is what is the evolutionary pressure on the rural mosquitoes that they haven't adapted to kind of the same degree that urban?
They usually prefer, and they've done preference studies, they usually prefer to the microbiome and laying their eggs in tree holes. And so, and we think a lot of it's just like, they usually live under canopy in the tree holes and develop there. So the pressure is probably not developing in an area that's as warm. And then in tree holes, and then tree holes are really nice because even if they're a dead tree or there's water in there, it wicks and evaporates. It's always nice and cool. So my guess is they probably show better development at lower temperatures. And they come out bigger, lay more eggs, that sort of thing. Where usually when you start increasing temperature like this, and these factors usually come out smaller. So you survive, but you may come out a little bit smaller and lay a few more eggs. And so, and then after long periods of those traits, it allows you to survive in the hot area. But if you get thrown into the woods again, you're probably going to be outproduced by one adapted tree holes for the more kind of stable environment. Okay.
Dr. Reichard asked, to what extent does water quality affect survival of egg larvae?
Sewage, it depends on the species. So, Anopheles malaria mosquitoes usually like fresher water. The 80s and the Culex, particularly the Culex. If you could have like an open sewer pod, and they would develop perfectly fine in there. So, like with all that human waste, they actually may even grow better because there's a lot of food there, not unprocessed waste. But Anopheles are like more puddle, and so they like a little bit fresher water. And so it really depends on the species. If you throw in like aspects of like pollutants and that sort of thing, high levels of microplastics kill them, high levels of like toxic chemicals will kill them. But if it's just sewage, as long as they got enough water in there, mostly the 80s and the Culex, they'll go through just fine. Because they have like the bigger aspect is the high levels of like so like the high levels like urea in the water. But if it's pretty high, they'll probably still survive. They may be delayed a few days. I think it's really great urea, nitrogen transporting systems that can kind of detox. So they may grow a little slower, but they'll probably get through most waste. As long as there's like water in the waste, it's not like a solid mud book.
Wyckoff asked, what are the molecular mechanisms that could explain heat tolerance in mosquitoes? Are they similar to those in mammals?
Yeah, more or less. They're pretty similar. So different expression of heat proteins, kind of increased resistance to like oxidative stress, shifts in kind of phospholipid levels in cells to be more heat resistant, increased accumulation of specific kind of metabolites, so that kind of buffer like tribulose and kind of specific amino acids will buffer aspects. So they're pretty similar. They just operate a little bit differently because you're not trying to. I mean, in general, we experience a lot less heat, less infection. We experience a lot less heat stress than a lot of insects and ectotherms do because they're at the will of whatever the temperature is. We have a study with mosquitoes. They blood feed on you. Their body temperature increases from room temperature to 35 in about 16 seconds. It's one of the fastest temperature transitions for an animal system that's been ever documented. It's something like 1.1 degree increase per second. And so they have to be able to tolerate that, which is so their symptoms are a little different just because they're so at will of the environment. And a lot of it's, if it gets too warm, they try to move, find some shade somewhere. That's why, if you ever notice when it gets really, really hot during the summer, it seems like there's no insects out when it's really hot. They're all hiding in shade in that. Then they come out in the dawn and dusk when it gets a little bit cooler. That's why there's just like that midday hot period where they're just not out. They're not dead. They're doing what we're doing. They're trying to hide and keep themselves overheating.
Thank you for everyone.
Thank you very much.